Hi, welcome to the wet venting module. So we're going to look at Article 2521 wet venting and sizing wet vented systems. So the three different solar waste pipes that can act as wet vents are fixture drains. Here we have a fixture drain for a lavatory wet venting a water closet. Branches, so we see a branch draining two lavatories wet venting a shower. And soiler waste stacks. So we have two kitchen sink trap arms directly connected to a soiler waste stack, with the lower story being wet vented through the upper story, extending vertically as a stack vent. Here's a picture of two wet vented water closets. They are wet vented through a fixture drain wet vent that, once it picks up the second trap arm, becomes a branch wet vent. So all of these fixtures would be located on the same story. It's not a soiler waste stack. Above the highest connected fixture, this point right here, above this point we have just a vertical dry vent called a continuous vent. Okay, so the table that is used to size wet vented systems is table 2581. And the first thing you need to ask yourself when you use the table is the wet vent serving one or two water closets, or is the wet vent not serving any water closet? Because the maximum number of water closets we can serve with one wet vented system is 2. So for example, in this scenario, we have a shower wet vented through the fixture drain of a lavatory. On table 2581, we would look at the columns that says not serving water closets. We have one fixture unit to apply, so up to 2 fixed units can be served by an 1.5 inch wet vent. That would be the minimum size. So there are no 1.25 inch wet vents. This lavatory would, or could be, if it was minimum size, this could be all 1.25 inch, and it would be an 1.25 inch trap arm if it's an 1.25 inch lavatory. But once the trap arm connects to this sanitary T fitting, we have an 1.5 inch minimum from that point below. With water closet, the minimum size of any wet vent, first one that's available, is 2 inch. So anytime a water closet is being wet vented through an adjacent fixture, 2 inch minimum is always the rule. Okay, so as I said earlier, the maximum number of water closets that can be served by one wet vent is 2. If there are 2 water closets, they must be symmetrically connected, so they must connect at the same point to the lowest point of the wet vented system. So when water closets are connected, they are the low point of the wet vented system. On a vertical stack, it will be a double sanitary T fitting, typically. On horizontal branches, we would likely see a double Y fitting to connect those 2 water closets. Other fixtures can symmetrically connect with the water closets as well. If the fixtures, like this bathtub, connect symmetrically with the water closet, the load of those connected fixtures is not included when sizing the wet vent. So for example, if we took minimum sizes from table 2493 and assigned 4 fixed units to this, we'll call it a flush tank water closet, an 1.5 inch bathtub is 1.5 fixed units, and the lavatory at minimum 1.25 inch would be 1 fixed unit. So the load of the bathtub, because it's symmetrically connected with the water closet, is not included when we size the wet vent. The load on sizing this wet vent is only the load that drains through the wet vent, which is the 1 fixed unit from the lavatory. So here's the same situation, only we have the bathtub on a separate fitting connected above the water closet. Again, the water closet must be the most downstream connection on the wet vent. We know these 2 lower fixtures are wet vented because the trap arms have no vents. So when trap arms don't have vents, they typically are wet vented or circuit vented. So now that the bathtub is not symmetrically connected, again, we had 1.5 for the bathtub, 4 for the water closet, and 1 for the lav. So now we have the lav and the bathtub draining into the wet vent. At this point, we have a branch wet vent draining 2.5 fixed units, and the load is consistent through the wet vent. So from the highest connected fixture to the water closet, that entire section is loaded at 2.5 fixed units. And serving water closets, it would be minimum 2-inch. So symmetrically connected fixtures, we don't include the load on the wet vent. If they aren't symmetrically connected, they are included. Here's a scenario where the bathtub trap arm exceeds the maximum length that is permitted to reach the wet vent. So if this is an 1.5 inch bathtub at 1.5 fixed units, and the length of the trap arm back to the wet vent, let's say, if it exceeded 6 feet, then we would need to separately vent it or configure it differently. So if we individually vent this bathtub trap arm, now we've created a separately vented fixture drain at this point here. So we have a fixture drain, 1.5 inch fixture drain, separately vented, but it's been connected into the wet vent portion. When we size the wet vent, because this load is draining into what's acting as the vent for this lower fixture, the water closet, we have to include the separately vented load. But because it has its own vent for its trap, we do not include its load in the continuous vent. So the load of the bathtub would be included. We'd have 2.5 fixed units when sizing the wet vent, and if this is a 4 fixture unit water closet and a one fixture unit lavatory. But when sizing the continuous vent we would say only serves 5 fixed units, as the individual vent takes care of the bathtub. Okay, so that's the deal with separately vented fixtures draining into wet vents. Got to include their load on the wet vent. Okay, so we're going to look at the next requirement for multi-story stack wet vent. When we have stack wet vents or wet vented soil or waste stack, we're only permitted to have 4 fixed units above the first story. So if these were kitchen sinks, we'll go with 1.5 inch, 1.5 fixed units each. We don't include the load of the lowest fixture or fixtures that are symmetrically connected, but we include the load of everything else that is draining into the soil or waste stack. And like this requirement says, the load is the same throughout the wet vent. So at any point on this wet vent down to the lowest T, we would say for the purposes of sizing that we have 6 fixed units draining into the wet vent, with these last 3 fixed units from the lowest kitchen sinks draining into the branch that serves the rest of the system. So the lowest story not included, the lowest fitting not included, and we're not permitted to have more than 4 fixed units draining into the wet vented stack above the first story. So they're limiting how much load we allow into the stack at higher elevations. Again, and what the code is trying to limit is the likelihood of the stack having too much load entering it and maybe plugging off the stack and not permitting that free flow of air. Again, with wet vents, what we're trying to do is accommodate both the draining and the venting of fixtures. So it kind of makes sense that we're limiting how many fixed units are permitted above the first story. By the way, not serving water closets, on table 2581, we'd be looking down this column here, no water closet being served. We said we had 6 fixed units draining into the stack. We don't include the lowest most fitting. So we look for a number that is 6 or greater down the list. The first we find is this category for 12. Look to the left and the size of our wet vent will be 3 inches. So this wet vent would be 3 inch in size from its connection to the stack vent, minimum, all the way down through the remainder of the system.